Welcome to Podkey PPR, where big NFL moves meet sharper fantasy reality checks. Two trades rewired two franchises, and the fantasy market is already sprinting to conclusions. The useful question isn't whether these moves are exciting, it's which parts actually change volume, efficiency, cap flexibility, and win probability, and which parts are just headline shock. The biggest move is A.J. Brown to the Patriots for a 2028 first and a 2027 fifth, and the price tells you New England wasn't shopping for a nice upgrade, they were buying a true offensive identity shift. The cap mechanics matter here because this wasn't just football logic. By waiting until after June 1, the deal becomes a lot easier to absorb. The reporting says Brown's immediate dead cap burden drops dramatically from roughly $43 million to around 16, and the Patriots can smooth salary across league years instead of taking the full hit at once. For the Eagles, that means roughly $30 million in cap relief plus real draft capital. That's not random luck. It's the payoff from structuring contracts in a way that keeps players tradable later, even expensive stars. The football case for New England is straightforward. Brown can command 120 to 150 targets, and if Drake May is actually ready to push the ball vertically, Brown gives him something the Patriots haven't really had in years, a receiver who changes coverage before the snap and wins anyway. The harder part is ranking the outcome. The bullish case is 1,100 to 1,400 yards and double-digit touchdowns because the target tree gets narrow fast. The cautious case is that Brown's efficiency had already dipped some, he has injury history, and a new offense doesn't automatically turn into a high-volume passing environment. So when fantasy ranks swing from borderline WR1 to more like WR2 territory, both arguments have logic. Volume probably rises. Efficiency is less certain. A worse overall offense can still feed one alpha receiver, but touchdown quality and weekly stability may suffer. The off-field reporting adds another layer. There were claims of friction in Philadelphia and tension with Jalen Hurts. That's relevant as context for why a player gets moved, but it's also the part people overread. Chemistry stories often become all-purpose explanations after a trade. The cleaner, better-supported explanation is that Philadelphia chose flexibility and New England paid for immediate offensive credibility. This move also changes everyone else's job description. Secondary Patriots wideouts can slide into cleaner complementary roles instead of pretending to be number ones, and the defense has to respect the deep boundary more often. That can help the run game in indirect ways, but it can also siphon easy checkdowns and manufactured touches if the offense leans harder into downfield looks. So the overall passing pie may improve while some ancillary fantasy pieces actually lose convenience volume. In Philadelphia, the biggest obvious beneficiary is Dallas Goedert if target share gets redistributed, and Devonta Smith has already shown he can produce spike weeks when Brown isn't dominating the funnel. That doesn't mean every Eagle becomes a bargain. It means the hierarchy is less settled than it was a week ago. The other franchise-level move is Myles Garrett to the Rams for Jared Verse and a 2027 first. If Brown to New England was about creating offense, this one is about collapsing time for opposing quarterbacks. Garrett is still an elite pressure player, and pairing that with a remade secondary can have second-order effects that stats sometimes miss. Better edge pressure makes average corners look better because the coverage clock gets shorter. It also changes game scripts. Leads get stickier when third and long becomes a real problem instead of a wish. That's why the immediate shift in Super Bowl odds isn't crazy. It may be a little noisy, but the direction makes sense. For Cleveland, the return signals acceptance of a different timeline. Verse is a real young asset, the first-rounder matters, and cap and roster flexibility have value when your current build isn't close enough. The cost is obvious, though. You don't trade a defensive game wrecker and stay the same in the short term. This is a step back now for optionality later. The Giants' story is less sexy and maybe more predictive. Malik Neighbors suffering an ACL injury, plus meniscus cleanup changes the ceiling of the entire offense. And Week 1 uncertainty matters because recovery timelines are not just about activation, they're about explosiveness, workload, and trust in the knee. If he returns into a run-heavier setup and only sees something like 6 to 8 targets a game, the name value can outrun the actual opportunity. That's especially important in fantasy, where people draft the healthy version in their heads. The rest of the roster doesn't offer much comfort. Concerns about the offensive line were already there, and if you also believe the interior roster moves weakened run defense and trench play, then the path to clearing a 7.5 win bar gets thin fast. Coaching instability only adds noise. Even if a new staff tweak sounds good on paper, offensive continuity usually helps more than it hurts, especially for a team already trying to survive injuries and roster imbalance. The WR10 through WR18 range is where drafts get quietly won or lost because it feels safe and often isn't. Historically, that tier is volatile. Small differences in health, target share, and quarterback quality can turn a player from a comfortable starter into a weekly headache. Rashee Rice gets called the safest in that range if suspension concerns stay out of the way, and that makes sense because role security in a strong offense usually beats abstract talent bets. T. Higgins has touchdown upside, but the health caveat is not a footnote anymore. It's part of the player profile. Chris Olave is the kind of case where managers have to separate reputation from trend line. A sharp year 3 dip isn't automatic proof of decline, but it does demand a better reason for optimism than he's too talented to fail. Zay Flowers is almost the opposite problem. Useful player, but ceiling depends on whether the offense and target share actually expand enough. The lesson in this tier is simple. Don't treat WR2 pricing like WR1 certainty. This is where volume assumptions break quickest. One strategy debate worth keeping is whether you should actively chase record-breaking upside in certain formats instead of drafting for median outcomes. That argument is stronger in top-heavy contests than in normal home leagues because first-place equity matters more than avoiding 6th. The names floated for huge outcomes mostly make intuitive sense. Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, even Derrick Henry, if volume and goal line work spike enough. But the historical comps matter. LaDainian Tomlinson's 2006 season is still such an outlier that invoking it should remind you how hard these outcomes are, not make them feel normal. At receiver, Puka Nacua's path to absurd volume is at least legible because of the way that offense concentrates targets. That's different from saying 2,000 yards is likely. It's a ceiling case, not a baseline projection. Market mispricing is more actionable than ceiling theatre. Nico Collins has a strong, undervalued argument because elite yards per route efficiency across multiple seasons tends to be more meaningful than vague complaints about situation. On the other side, someone like Alec Pierce getting a big contract may signal team belief, but contract size doesn't erase a thin volume history. That's where the market can confuse endorsement with proven fantasy role. Patrick Mahomes sliding in ADP is one of the more interesting quarterback debates because it turns on what kind of fantasy edge you think he still provides. If the rushing never really rebounds after the ACL, then a meaningful part of his ceiling is just gone. That doesn't make him a bad real-life quarterback. It narrows the ways he buries you in fantasy relative to the very top tier. Add concerns about protection, receiver uncertainty, and the general fragility of projecting touchdown spikes, and the discount makes more sense than the panic does. That also explains why some analysts prefer a strong 2-quarterback build over forcing a third fringe option. Depth is useful, but not all depth is equal. A marginal QB3 can turn into dead roster space fast. The same risk discipline applies to Josh Jacobs. The legal situation alone creates suspension downside even before any on-field argument, and the on-field case was already shakier than his name value suggests, given the lack of explosive runs and recent efficiency concerns. When both talent trend and availability trend point the wrong way, that's usually not a buying opportunity. The Ultimate Draft Kit launch is mostly product news, but the underlying idea is sound. Fantasy prep gets better when you can compare consensus to your own ranks and quickly isolate where the market is too high or too low. Tools are only useful if they sharpen decisions rather than replace them, and that applies to any app, any rankings set, and honestly, any podcast too. That's the board for today on Podkey PPR. Big moves create big narratives, but the edge usually comes from slowing down long enough to see what's actually changed and what's just louder now. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.